Hello and welcome. My name is Ty Nicolopoulos. I'm Vice President of Marketing at Beewise, and we are very honored today to host Zac Ellis from OFI in conversation with our co-founder, Eliyah Radzyner, for our latest Pollination Leaders Fireside Chat.
Thanks, Ty. Eliyah Radzyner here, co-founder of Beewise, beekeeper in practice. And Zac, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. Appreciate it, everyone. Always happy to talk about this subject. It's one of my favorites. I'm Zac Ellis with Olam Food Ingredients. I'm the Senior Director of Agronomy. I've been there for about 10 years now, looking at all things ag tech, sustainability, agronomy, soil science, those types of things. I'm also a PhD student at UC Davis, and I'm in my fourth year of instruction. So I have this year and next year, and then hopefully we'll be done. So together we take care of about 12,000 acres here in California of mostly almonds. We also have Australian orchards that are about 50,000 acres total with all of us combined. So there's 40 in Australia and 10 here, 10 to 12 here in California.
Beautiful. Zac, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all that have joined to listen. And Ty and Lucy, thank you for setting it up. I'm super excited about this conversation. Zac, you and I go back a few years now. I think this is the fourth year we're working together in pollination of almonds for Olam Food Ingredients. And you personally and Olam Food Ingredients as a company that we work with have been, a great partner over the last 4 years. And I've always kind of admired the way you guys, your process and your thought leadership around innovation in general, and specifically when it comes to bees, your approach around sustainability and how you integrate those two. So hopefully we can explore a little bit of that today. So we're going to talk a little bit about, technology, adopting technology, how that intertwines with, the sustainability initiatives that you're trying to take. And of course, talk a little bit about pollination and some other stuff as well. So I was thinking maybe we could start off, kind of from the top of when we met and when we started working together, Olam and Beewise, Eliyah and Zac, and kind of take that as a case study of how Olam looks at, again, these two things, technology and sustainability, how you assess them early on, how you assess them once you start working with them, and how you decide to adopt or not adopt specific technologies, specific solutions, specific practices. So I thought I'd start off with, the rigorous process you guys put us through to start working with you. And then maybe you could kind of zoom out and talk about that as a process for OFI. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, that sounds great. Absolutely. So yeah, OFI is a huge company, global company, a lot of notoriety in a lot of good ways. What that does for a guy like me is it puts a pretty big target on my back for the startups of the world, the ag tech companies of the world. In fact, my first job at Olam was pretty much to evaluate ag tech and just see, where we could fit these different relevant or irrelevant ag tech solutions within our operation. So from day one, that was really, we were the litmus test, and my boss at the time, and subsequently all of the bosses that I've had, I haven't had a whole lot, but a few, they've all had the same ethos, which is, innovate, make mistakes, try new things, break stuff. That's the only way that we're going to learn. We also kind of have a bit of a responsibility as a large, production leader here in the industry to take on some more of those risks that maybe a more resource rich company can take the brunt of those, make the mistakes, make the adjustments, and learn things from those. And then hopefully, is what Olam wants to do, and what I truly want to do is spread that knowledge to the industry, and let smaller growers have access to some of these more complicated, nuanced problems and solutions.
Okay, beautiful. I think that's been my experience, looking from outside. But yeah, today we'll explore that a little bit. So when we first reached out to Olam, we didn't know each other yet at that point. And we reached out. We wanted to see if you guys would be interested in testing us for pollination. And this was, I guess this was 2021, somewhere mid 2021.
2021.
And the first thing that we got from Olam was, um, go and talk to some of our beekeepers, and we want to hear their opinion about the technology, which I thought at the time made a lot of sense. Like, you guys aren't beekeepers. This is a solution that has to do with bees. You want to hear what your expert, your trusted beekeepers had to think about it. So I remember one of those meetings, I had to drive down to Bakersfield to meet with one of your beekeepers and kind of walk them through this new idea. Um, and after that, I think you must have gotten some positive feedback. You were willing to meet with me, and that was our first meeting when we met. You and I personally. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that process. Like you said, you've got a target on your back. All the startups in ag tech are trying to get an audience with you, trying to get you to test out their product. What's how do you can't test every product out there, right? So
No.
there's so talk about that first stage of just assessing, early on. Um, what's the process? How do you look at that? How did you look at that back then? How do you look at that today? If anything has changed?
Yeah, great question. So, this is something that we refined over time, and it really is specific to the type of product or thing that you're testing, right? If it's a technology, if it's using like information and data technology and analytics, then it's a little different in how we evaluate it. But if it's a product, or if it's a service or something in the field, we really rely heavily on good data, right? And the whole reason I went back to school, the whole reason I'm in school now, is to really get that foundational understanding of what kind of data we need to see in order to definitively know that this is something that we should be focusing on or spending our time on. Um, not to say that if you don't have a lot of data that we're not going to evaluate and try to see if there's a solution, but you know, when a new ag tech company comes to me, the first thing that I'm really asking is, like, what is the problem that we're focusing on here? Where does that lie, and is that problem a shared problem? Do I have that problem as well? If I do, then the next logical question is, okay, well, what does the solution look like? Have you tried it in my settings before? An almond orchard or in California? Have you gotten any data that shows that it works, that it does solve this problem that we've found and that you've focused on? You know, uh, and that's hard in an environmental conditions being the way they are, a living plant that we have to grow in these differing environmental conditions. It just makes it really, really hard to know whether the result that you got this year is the same result you're going to get next year or the year after that. And so when we first start, we want a lot of data. We want to look at statistics. We want to look at all of the mind-numbing spreadsheets and analysis that most growers probably don't really want to see. That it's exhausting for them, maybe even overwhelming. We welcome all of that. We have a variety of people that like that data and that will take that data and really evaluate it. If a company doesn't have that, if they're not to that point yet, and they're still in a more immature phase. We will try to support that company in gathering that type of data and building that proof of concept and that foundational knowledge, but we won't move forward until we have that data and we feel sufficiently, uh, you know, it, so that we feel in a way that if we use this product, we'll be satisfied with the result, and whatever that definition of satisfaction means. So,
So
for some
it's
companies, it's short. For the for an example's sake, Beewise, you didn't have a whole lot of data at the time. I think I was the very first California grower that you talked to, which is amazing, and also terrifying at the time, but I'm glad it all worked out. But we started slow and we scaled it over time, and we looked at all of the data that you had. I mean, I think you can attest to the fact that we were hungry for the information. We were wanting it. We didn't want to shy away from any of that. And eventually, the data speaks for itself, and you really know how to interpret it. You can understand, what direction you're headed. And in the case of Beewise, which is a success story for us, there was a lot of good data. A lot of it made sense. It was grounded in science. We included some of the UC folks and other people in the industry. And I think we've built something now, in terms of a relationship that is more of a partnership. And we want to see Beewise do well because we've seen what Beewise can do to our orchards. We understand that of the 250,000 plants that are flowering species in production and ag production, 90% of them need bees. But we also understand that the almond industry is the largest user of pollination services in the world, and that it really is our responsibility, from a bigger sense, not just from an almond and a business sense, but even above and beyond that. Making sure that we're doing the right thing and that we're good stewards, because really we're the start of the entire season. We're the first blooming crop. If we have good conditions for those bees to thrive, then the rest of the subsequent crops are going to do much better, and that's something that's important to all.
So I think we should just wrap up here. That was perfect. Not really. You've said so much in those 5 minutes, and I want to unpack it, and I also want to get into the rest of the process that you kind of alluded to. But yeah, you were the first grower that I talked to in California. We had worked with other growers before that, but not almond growers. So you were the first almond grower that we reached out to in California, and you gave us a chance. And I wanted to talk both about that data and about that problem set, that helps you evaluate, companies at that stage when they reach out to you for the first time. I think, for startups that see this conversation and are kind of thinking, how do we reach out to growers, whether it's Olam or any other growers, maybe it's it's not around bees, maybe. Um, if you don't have the data, I think the most important thing is a problem set. Is the problem a real problem that your customer is affected by? And does your solution make sense in terms of, actually solving that problem? Or maybe there's a misalignment between there could be two misalignments here, basically. One, maybe your problem is not your customer's problem. And number two, maybe the solution is only a partial solution, or it's not promising enough. And then if you don't have data, you don't have a good fit around the problem, that's going to diminish your chances of getting a good audience, I think. When you were looking at bees back then, and I know you guys have looked at several bee solutions or several solutions around pollination, did I guess, how did you see the problem back then? How is your understanding of the problem from a grower's perspective? And I think today, you just spoke about how the grower is important for the bees, the first bloom of the season, and building a healthy, population of bees throughout the year, and your responsibility as a grower, which is amazing. But from a grower's perspective, just for pollination, right? You need to get your crop pollinated. Um, what was the challenge? Like, why did Beewise sound like something you wanted to evaluate? Why were you evaluating other companies around pollination? Like, what is the issue for you around pollination as a grower?
Yeah, and this issue was actually interesting because I don't think when we first started looking at some of the other technologies, including Beewise, but there's several others that we've tried, we weren't really sure if we even had a problem in bees. There's a lot of talk, and of course it's true, but from our perspective as a grower, we hear a lot of things about how the bee population is changing and the high mortality rates, calling collapse and varroa mite. But you get to pollination season and your guys got your bees and you're like, okay, well, that sucks, but my guys are fine. So, what do I have to worry about? For us, it became more of a focus because of some of our partnerships with our consumer packaged good companies that look at, pollinator partnerships and certifications around being more bee friendly. And that was kind of something that was attractive to us. But then we started to learn about the intricacies of bees and, the whole system and the whole industry and how it works. And pretty quickly realized, wow, we have a huge problem. We have a huge problem. It's not presenting itself yet, but it is here and it's getting worse. And the solutions, the one thread that is holding the whole thing together at this point in terms of the industry is getting weaker and weaker. And so, we wanted to understand, okay, the only way we're going to be able to manage this better is if we measure it correctly, right? And so let's start with trying to figure out how we can measure bee health. And there's a bunch of companies that do that, right? And you put devices in your traditional Langstroth hives, and they give you all kinds of information, whether it's heat or acoustics or whatever it is. They've figured out a pattern and tried to figure out, okay, here's how we can correlate health to this signal that we're picking up on in the bee hive. And that turned out to be challenging for us. It was right around 2020 when COVID hit, a lot of supply chain issues, had some issues with getting some of those devices in, but we eventually did, and we looked at them, and we did our own inspections right behind them to kind of see if we thought they were good. There was some deviation in what we saw from our inspections versus what they were concluding, the health of the number of frames per hive. But that really wasn't the systemic issue. There was still some value there to see something, at least we have some kind of baseline. But we quickly realized that, like, what do we do about that? So great, we've got dead outs over there that are, not doing well or, dwindling hives. What can we do now that we have this information? What action can I take as an agronomist to help that, other than calling up my beekeeper and saying, I hope you have more bees and I hope it's not too late. And can you please bring more bees over here at an absolute premium? And hopefully that'll help. Right. So for us, and I think I've told you this, Elliot, many times before, it was definitely a rearview mirror look, right? We see it happening, but it happened already, and we're already on to the season, and there's nothing we can do about it. What attracted us to Beewise was there's a suite of technology that allows you to measure what's going on in that hive, but now there's actually some actionable items that can take place, right? We can go in, we can inspect. You guys can split hives, you can combine hives. There's this thermal therapy component. There's a lot of other parts, labor components for the beekeepers that get streamlined. There's just a lot more there's a lot more levers that you can pull with this versus what we were doing before. So that was really what we began to see, was that there's a problem. We need to do something about it. In comes the chat with Eliyah. Eliyah, you did a great job of explaining where you were and being very honest. It's also another thing I think a lot of startups lack, is they promised me the moon. And, almost within the first 15 minutes of the meeting, I can usually tell whether this is real or this is, some silver bullet that's not going to work, because there's an overpromise and an undercommitment. But Elio, I got to say, you guys under promised and over committed, and it worked out really well. The service is great. Did we run into problems? Yes, we did. There was challenges, as every year has, but we've seen so much success using this technology over some of the others that this is why we're scaling it. And this is why we think this is the next big thing for pollination.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think as a startup, you're always, trying to understand, can I, say exactly where we are? Is that going to scare off the customers at every stage? You're practically, developing the product as you're launching it with customers. And I think for us, it's always been, if that is going to scare off the customer, they're a future customer. They're not a customer for right now. We're looking for those customers, especially, back then in the early days. You're looking for those customers that have some appetite for risk and are able to understand that. It's again about setting expectations. If I tell you that everything is going to be amazing, everything is going to be perfect, I'm setting myself up for failure, right? Anything that goes wrong is a problem. Um, but if we can manage that risk and can control it, I think, and I think a good example of that is you actually taught me. Somebody asked you, okay, what happens if there's, if it's overcast for a few days and there's no power for the bee homes because they're solar powered. and
It's just a beehive then, right? It's just what you got from day one. It's a regular beehive. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so that's a way to manage risk. It goes back to, and I've adopted that since then. I actually got asked that this morning. I was giving another talk somewhere, and I was asked the same question: what happens if it's overcast? And I remembered your answer. I was like, it just goes back to being a regular hive. So
Yep, a well-insulated, beautiful Ritz-Carlton hive for those little bees, right?
okay, fantastic. So one more point before we move on. I think there's also kind of two, you kind of mentioned, is it a service? Is it data analytics? Is it an actual product? But there's also like the business model. And I think a lot of companies that reach out to Olam, to growers in general, the model is use our service, say, you're going to save money here, and that will allow you to pay us over here. With Beewise, we're not. I get this extra charges is on top of my pollination, and it's not. We charge market prices for pollination. How much, like, how important is that aspect for you to like test new technologies? Does that make it that much easier, or is it like not very significant for you from that perspective?
Like a cost savings initiative versus like a return on investment type
Well,
strategy?
like in terms of like Beewise, you already have a line item in your budget for pollination, right? It doesn't really matter which provider you spend it on, this company, that company. But if I came to you and said, look, I'm gonna reduce your labor cost by 5%, and I'm gonna charge you $1,000 a month per seat, but you have to hope that I am actually going to save you that labor saving, or that whatever higher yields, whatever I'm promising, right? Does that make it, like, the fact that you already have a line item, it's no extra cost to your budget? How how much does that like reduce the friction of trying out new solutions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge reduction in friction if it's comparable in terms of cost to your competition for sure. But I will say that there's two things, right? There's a cost savings component, which is great, but rarely happens when ag tech is involved, right? It's not a cost savings typically, maybe some variable rate stuff, but typically it's a cost increase, and really it's the return on investment, right? So you have to be. It's the old adage: you've got to spend money to make money, right? And you have to be willing to say, okay, um, these numbers make sense, these assumptions make sense. I believe that these can be attainable, and then you need to take a measured approach and really test it out in a way that that allows for you to see the results without exposing yourself to too much risk, which is why we never, we never scale anything 100% right away, right? Even if you had all the good data in the world, if you came to me and said, hey, I've got peer-reviewed data in Nature magazine showing that I can increase, visitation rate in almonds X amount, and it's the next big thing, and everyone's tested it, you're good to go. We would still want to scale that in a way that's meaningful. But the ROI component becomes much more challenging when that initial cost is high, right? When that cost to play is really expensive per acre, then the math that you have to do in order to show the return becomes a lot harder. The assumptions become broader and the risk becomes more. So, anytime we can get closer to that competitive pricing with ag tech, it just makes it a lot easier to get in there and see if it works. And a lot of time, even some they'll offer to give it to us for free, and say, hey, try it out for free, see if you think it'll give an ROI, which sometimes we're open to that as well. But even if it's free, we still need to do the math and, okay, what will it cost eventually? And if and when we get to that point, is it still going to make a return on our investment? I know it's free this year. I know we're going to get proof of concept, but we still need to understand the economics behind it. And the higher cost overage, the more challenging you get.
Makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about adoption and scale. So we've, again, Beewise specifically, but in general, the process of adopting a new technology, you get introduced to the concept, to the idea, you get pitched, you go through some gates, meet the beekeeper, meet this, meet that, show some data, and we're off to a pilot. I remember the first year we worked together. I forget if it was 700 acres or 700 hives, maybe 700 hives.
700 hives, yeah.
700 hives. And after the fact, you didn't tell me before, I learned that there was a UC Davis crew out there looking at activity, comparing
I didn't know you knew about that.
comparing us to I guess another provider or other hives. Um, so this is what you were collecting the data, right? You guys are obsessed about data, and you also want to see data that is real data, right? Not only rely on what the company is saying. You want to see third party data. Um, and yeah, maybe talk a little bit about this process of evaluating and deciding to scale. And I think in the past when we've talked about scaling, and you just alluded to it now, um, there's also a component there in scaling, not scaling too fast, to actually protect the company that you're trying to work with. You've mentioned that in the past. Can you talk more about this process of evaluation, getting third-party data, deciding to scale? Like, what are the thresholds to decide to scale, and then managing that scale in a responsible way?
Yeah, great questions, and a big reason why I'm on campus a lot, and a big advantage to that is that typically I have access to some really, really smart individuals, within different subject areas of agriculture. So, we're unique. My process is a little different than most, but typically, if a company comes to me with a new concept, I've I've probably got 10 to 15 different people that I reach out to that are in this world and that do these things. They're kind of my first litmus test of like, hey, have you heard of these people? The technology. What do you know about it? What have you heard? Try to get kind of what the rumors are around the tech initially. Then it moves more into like a formal process of, okay, let's understand exactly what we're addressing, what the technology does, how it works, mode of action, all of that. Once I get a good understanding of where they're coming from, I will kind of go and pitch that to whomever I think is relevant within the UC system or UC A&R system. Um, I've yet to find an ag tech company that hasn't fit with somebody at UC Davis or Fresno State or Cal Poly that knows all about what this is. So, developing a network, and really, we're a large grower, but the network didn't come from being a large grower. It just came from, being out there and talking to people and being involved with UC outreach, being involved with these different trade shows that are out there, whether it's pollination or fertility or whatever. It's all agriculture. So developing a network is really important and helpful for smaller growers as well. I've been able to do that now at Davis and develop a network. And so I'm using that and leveraging that component to really understand more intimately whether these problems are actually, or these solutions rather, are actually going to solve my problem. From there, if let's say there's not a whole lot of data, we have contract research organizations that we work with. So we will allow for you to come and use our orchards as a testing ground. But we want to do it in a way that creates good data governance. So we know that the data that's being collected is being collected by a third party. And as much as I want to just trust everybody that they're going to give us good data and it's going to be real and objective, we need to have a third party collect that kind of information for us on our ranch. So we'll have a CRO come out and do that type of work. We will typically pay for the untreated control, and then any treatments that need to be taken underway through the CRO is paid by the vendor, by the ag tech company. And, that's been a really successful way of fleshing out the companies that don't believe in their product well. There's a lot of companies that come, and once you really tell them, okay, we'll put your money where your mouth is. I've got an orchard, I've got a CRO. It's going to cost you $10,000, but let's go out here and let's actually see what happens, and let's put statistics behind it and see whether or not we can replicate that in the future. There's a vast majority of them never call me back, right? A lot of them say, oh, that's too scary, or it's not in the cards. And it's really not that expensive considering the amount of data that you get. Important as data is in agriculture and in these types of situations, it's a good investment. But if, let's say, they have all of that done and they've got good data, we look at it, some of it's peer reviewed, maybe, or published. Now we're saying, okay, these guys are legit, right? They've withstood the scrutiny of the scientific method well enough to publish papers on this, to get peer reviewed. Like, let's take them to the next step. Now let's get into commercial trials. Let's split blocks. Let's go on acres instead of trees. And then from there, every year is a reevaluation. We really try, I really try, and I try to encourage with my team, to come into every year without any preconceived notions from last year, right? So don't think that just because they did well the year before that they're going to do well this year, and assume that, because that's typically when things falter. So we try to go into every year and just make sure that that we look at it objectively, and that if we all agree that we should scale, we're never going to scale more than 25 to 50% of whatever they're on right now in terms of acreage, right? So if you're on 100 acres, next year you'll probably be on 150 acres, something like that, maybe 200 acres. It starts to scale more as we get further into it, years 2 and 3. But typically the first couple of years, it's smaller plots, but commercial. And then it gets into maybe a 50% increase year over year until we get to like really feeling comfortable. And again, an example with Beewise, right? We got into year 3, and now instead of saying, okay, I'm going to give you a couple hundred acres, now we're talking thousands of acres that we're giving you as a result of, we didn't scale that way from day 1 or day 2 or year 1 or year 2. It took time, but now we've built the confidence and we understand the technology well enough to say, okay, now we're willing to risk, scaling more because we're confident not only in the technology, but to what your point was before, Eliyah, it's making sure that you guys are able to scale. And the last thing I want to do is blow up a great ag tech company because I wanted too much too fast from them, and they tried to scale with me and ended up falling flat on it. So we're aware of that. We've seen that happen before. We've been burnt by that. We've also burnt others by doing that. And through that experience, we know that it's best for both parties if we build together but slowly, and very deliberately. And the last thing I'll say, and one thing that you've been really good at, Eliyah, is the communication. Not when there's good news. I don't care when there's good news. I know there's good news if there's no news, but when there's bad news, right? No company wants to call their potential vendor up and give them bad news, right? But the reality of the situation is I'm going to find out about it eventually. And if I don't find out through you, and I have to find out through myself, that distracts all of us from the objective, right? Which is to try to get this thing to work, and to solve a problem. So kudos to you for communicating, even when things hadn't gotten bad yet. You would call me and give me a bit of a warning and be like, hey, truck's not going to be in there tomorrow. We said it would, but it's just not going to happen, but there's rain. What do we do? Like, now we can plan together. We can have a partnership and we can decide together what we're going to do, instead of you freaking out, not saying anything, and then unilaterally making a decision that is not informed well enough to be the best decision for us as an organization. So communication is super important. Making sure that we feel confident by slowly scaling at first, but then letting it go a little bit later as we feel more confident, and just grounding all of that in science, whether it's science that's already been done, which is the preference, but usually not the reality, or on the other side, let's do the science together, but let's think about the experimental design. Let's make sure that whatever we do, it's worth the time of doing it. And we're not just doing it to say that we got something out there to try, to look at, quote unquote. It ends up being more confusing than anything when you do that. And I think it's important to have expectations set prior to the trial so that everyone's aware of what's going on.
So thank you for the kind words, Zach. And I think, just to kind of summarize this point, and then I want to ask you a little bit about you as a student as well, and how that ties into the bigger, I think Olam kind of mentality and culture. But before that, just to summarize this point, I think as a young startup, um, and even if you're not a startup, you're just a vendor supplying a service to a customer, and something goes wrong, you want to fix it, you want to know that you have a solution, you don't want them to even know about it, right? That's your natural response. Oh my God, especially if it's a large customer, an important customer. And I think this ties in very um, very well with what I was saying earlier about finding the right, the fact that you guys have a mentality that things are going to break, and we're building this confidence together. The fact that in scaling responsibly, you're not only thinking about protecting yourselves, building the confidence for yourself, but it's not all about the technology. You might test something out on 100 acres or 200 acres. It works really well, um, because the technology is good, but the company isn't there yet in terms of being able to service, let's say now 3,000 acres. The service component there is very, very important to be able to scale and scale responsibly. So I think as a company, you need to lead with vulnerability. Sometimes you need to be able to call and say, hey, we had a problem. We had a problem once with the entrances. You remember?
Yeah. Doors
I'm
kept
sure you do.
open.
So, you know, told you about the entrances, told you what we're doing right now to solve it, and what's the longer plan, because sometimes solutions take, the real solution is a little bit longer. But yeah, you gotta, if you have the right partners, I think that's the most important part. Find the right partners, set the right expectations. There are going to be problems, and then deliver on those. Deliver on the problems as well. You promise there are going to be problems. Deliver on them.
Yeah, what's more impressive to me than anything is when a vendor or an ag tech company runs into a problem and then they not only fix it, but they put in processes or SOPs for future reference so that that problem doesn't become a problem again. That always is impressive to me, because not only does that mean that you can recognize that there is a problem and that needs to be fixed, but that you're nimble enough to be able to make the pivot and make the switch in time for it to be, effective from a grower's perspective, from my perspective. And that's hard to do. And there's a lot of companies that, will say, hey, this isn't right. This isn't going to work. We need to do it this way. And they'll say, yeah, you're right. That was a terrible idea the way we did it. Your idea is better. And then we come back a year later and they're still doing the same thing. And you go, well, what happened? Where did that break down? And a lot of the time I think it's that they get busy or overwhelmed, or there's just things are going too fast. But the companies that can slow down and listen to those subtle things that the growers are telling them or their customers telling them, and then act on those and come back with a solution, that's more compelling to me than if we had no problems at all and everything was just smooth, because that doesn't tell me the character of the company or the people who work in that company. It just tells me that their product is good, right? But what happens when things go wrong? That's an important component that you have to know when you're partnering with big ag tech companies, especially with a company. Pollination is, as you guys know, the largest, biggest thing for us. It's the Super Bowl before the Super Bowl, right? It's the pre-Super Bowl before harvest, which is the Super Bowl. We have to get that right in order for our whole season to be okay and to be successful. And we're putting that responsibility in your hands. We believe in this because we know not only will it work, but that the service behind it, the communication behind it, the leadership behind it has our best interests at heart. That's the goal when we talk to ag tech companies, is to develop a partnership like the partnership we have with Beewise.
It's amazing. Thank you. I want to do a quick time check. We're about to get into Q&A after this last question from Eliyah. So to the audience, now's a great time to submit your questions into chat, and we'll move into Q&A in just a minute or two.
Thank you, Ty. So, Zac, tell us a little bit about what you're doing at UC Davis. And I think this is another, just for the audience, this is another great example of, how Olam Food Ingredients, think about business, about agriculture, how obsessed they are with data. They're supporting you, and enabling you to do this, these years at school while still maintaining, a full-time position at OFI. And I think it's a really good example, of why you're such a good fit for Olam Food Ingredients, why they're a good fit for you, and why you guys are, such good partners for companies like us. So please tell us a little bit about what you're doing at UC Davis.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think Olam is, way before my time, with Sonny Bernays, who's the CEO founder of the company, and back in 1989. It was a trading company at first, and then it moved in more upstream into farming and, the different commodities that are more profitable as you go upstream to the farm gate. But I'll never forget the second year I was here, they flew me to Singapore to do this like leadership conference. And I thought it was kind of funny because I was really new, and I was like, why am I going? Like, I don't understand why you're inviting me. I don't think I should be here. Right. I'm new. I'm just trying to figure it out. But I went, and it was really compelling. It was great because Sonny was there. Sonny has since stepped down as like CEO. He's still on the board and still an active role, but back then he was kind of running things, and it took me aback because he had literally said on his one of his like final speeches that Olam as a company has to prioritize a few things. And he started to list off those things. And the first thing that he listed off was sustainability over profitability. And I thought, that's weird. Sustainability over profitability? And it stuck with me. And I actually ended up asking my boss at the time, like, hey, I don't really understand this. Like, what about sustainability is more important than the company being profitable? And his answer, which is an answer that obviously Sonny has been giving for a long time now in the company, is that sustainability is the key to profitability, right? If we can't sustain what we're doing right now, then profitability will sink inevitably. And so we have to really think about, what are we doing? How are we being good stewards of the environment? How are we thinking about the soil plant atmosphere continuum in ways that allow us to be sustainable? And from that moment forward, my entire ethos around all of what I was doing with Olam was like, let's go out there and look for things that can help us meet these goals, which are very unique for a company the size that Olam is. And yeah, you're right. I mean, they've always allowed me to gather a lot of data, to use technology, to adopt new things early. And